Our record button's not showing. Okay.
So we all set?
We're all set. Let's get started.
Hey, thank everybody for joining in tonight. We can't see you, but hopefully you can see us for at least a couple of minutes, and then we're going to switch to a presentation. I want to thank everybody for participating in this kind of experiment that we're doing, trying to engage our members and friends in a way to help shape the future of Vermont. We're in the middle of a pretty important process with the Act 46 Commission, who was appointed last year formed by the legislature. And Act 46 is the name of the law that established a commission to look at and evaluate and update Act 250, Vermont's landmark development law, for the next 50 years. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about that in a moment. For those of you who aren't that familiar with Vermont Natural Resources Council, we were founded in 1963. We're Vermont's oldest environmental advocacy organization. My name is Brian Shoup. I'm the executive director of VNRC. We have 4 program areas. We have a climate and energy program, we have a sustainable communities program, a water program, and a forest and wildlife program. And all of those programs have an interest in the outcome of this process that we're engaged in now in reshaping Act 250 for the next 50 years. That's a high priority of ours, and that's why we're really pleased that you have taken the time to meet with us over the internet and talk about the public sessions that are coming up. Kate McCarthy, who is to my right, is our Sustainable Communities Program Director. She has taken the lead in putting this webinar on and engaging our members around these public sessions that are happening around the state, the next one being Wednesday night in Royalton. And I'm going to turn the next part of this webinar over to her.
Great. Thanks, Brian, for the introductions. I also want to acknowledge someone else who's here who you can't see, and that's Stephanie Gomery. You have received emails from her. She's our communications director and is providing technical support, which we really appreciate. It's a team effort. As Brian said, this is a high priority of VNRC, and just by way of background regarding me and Brian, we've both been involved in Act 250 hearings over the years, variously as parties to the case, expert witnesses, and technical advisors. And other VNRC staff have been very closely involved in Act 250 as well. So we really hope to bring your expertise as people living and experiencing Vermont and Act 250, as well as our 50-year history with this law, to this very important process. So what we're going to do now is switch to slides instead of video, and I will orient everybody to what comes next. Okay, I do believe we are on slides. All right, so I want to give you an overview of today's call. The purpose of this webinar is, you are all people who are interested in attending this webinar, and so we have been to the first 2 public meetings of the Act 47 Commission. And so what we want to do in this webinar is help you know what to expect and how you can most effectively engage in these upcoming meetings. In this call, we're going to cover a few things to help you do this. We're going to give you a little bit more of an overview of the Act 47 Commission. We're going to give you some Act 250 basics, just to orient you or reorient you to the law and what it does. We'll let you know what VNRC's priorities are so that those can be food for thought for you as you prepare to engage in these public meetings. And then we also want to give you, excuse me, kind of a preview of what the meeting will be like. As you've probably seen in various emails, it's not your typical public hearing, but it is a chance for voices to be heard, and we want to make sure you're comfortable doing that and kind of know what to expect. So just one point that I definitely want to clarify is that these meetings are being held by the Act 47 Commission. They are not being organized or sponsored by VNRC. Of course, as longtime advocates for Act 250, we really want to help people engage effectively in these meetings and to learn about other ways to engage too. So that's an overview of where we're headed in the next 45 minutes or so. Next, I'd like to just orient you to a couple of logistical items. We have some folks joining us today using the webinar interface. We also have several of you who are joining us by just telephone. So I just want you to know how you can engage. So if you have questions, you can use the chat box and type your questions in throughout the webinar, and we'll address those as possible. We'll fit them in as best we can as Brian and I continue to present. At the end of the session tonight, we are going to have a more open Q&A, and we are going to attempt to allow you to speak with your voices instead of just typing, though both will be welcome, just to get a little more exchange going. We're going to try and do that. What that would mean is unmuting yourself at the appointed time if you're using just the phone, and we can unmute you if you're here on the web. So anyway, short version, type questions during the presentation, and we'll try and get some exchange and talking going at the very end. We will be making this presentation available afterwards. We think we are recording it now. I'm assured that we are. And even if we are not, or if you'd prefer not to see the recording, we can make the PDF of the presentation available. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Brian, who's going to talk a little more about the Act 47 Commission itself.
Great, thanks, Kate. So the Act 47 Commission was created through legislation passed last year in 2017. And we worked quite a bit with some of our friends and colleagues in the legislature on shaping the legislation. And it grew out of a pretty much a growing understanding that Act 250, while it has served the state well in many respects, is 50 years old. Many of the contemporary challenges facing the state today weren't widely understood at the time in 1970 when the law was passed, and that we have created a much more robust infrastructure around land use planning and regulation and infrastructure investment that didn't exist then, and that this might be a good time to take a step back and examine the law and see how it might better address some of the issues that we're facing today and into the future. So the commission is formed by 6 legislators. They're all identified on this slide. Also, there is an advisory board that was appointed by the legislation to the commission. VNRC has a seat on that representing environmental interests. There's also real estate and planning and municipal interest represented on that advisory board. And we've been involved with working with the commission throughout the process. They have a pretty ambitious public outreach effort. The public sessions that are happening now aren't the only opportunity to have input in the process. There's online commenting is encouraged. There's going to be a survey distributed by the commission, but this is one of several of the more important processes. And what the commission is hoping to do is they did a lot of research and work with the advisors early in the process to understand how the law works and what some of the issues are. This is the public process to reach out to Vermonters across the state to understand what your interests, concerns, and values are. And they will meet in the fall to begin drafting a report. And the goal is to draft legislation to revise and update Act 250. So those are the 3 components of their work. And then our goal is that there will be legislation. The legislature will consider those recommendations come next January at the start of the next legislative biennium. So as I mentioned, this was a priority passing this update or this look at Act 250, and it continues to be one of our highest priorities to help shape it going forward. And I'm hoping that our members and all of you can help us do that. So a little bit of the basics of Act 250. It was something that's really important. It was created out of concern that the rate of change in land development in the state was outpacing the Vermont's ability to manage it, and that some of our core values, our environmental resources, our natural resources, our communities' ability to absorb new growth and development, were all under threat by really unregulated, unplanned development. So a commission, the Gibb Commission, was formed in the late 1960s. They had an outreach session that took them around the state and came up with the basics of Act 250. It was created in 1970. It was intended to have a state land use plan with it, which ultimately was defeated in the legislature, and that's an issue I'll come back to. And one of the important comments that I want to make about Act 250. Oftentimes when we discuss how it works, we talk about how much it costs for developers, how much time it takes. It was really intended to be measured by the resources protected, how it maintains Vermont's quality of life, and not just the length of the review period. Having said that, that is important that it be fair and accessible to everyone, and we do understand the need to have a fair and predictable process. But ultimately, the goal of Act 250 was to maintain Vermont's character and the quality of our natural resources. So just really quickly, how it works. It was somewhat ingenious at the time that it was a citizen-run process. It's regional in scope, with 9 regional commissions made up of 3 volunteers, citizens from all walks of life, and alternates, staffed by district coordinator and district staff. And initially, for the first 35 or so years, those decisions were appealable to another citizen board, the Vermont Environmental Board. That was changed in '04, changed for the worse. It's an issue that's going to be addressed by the commission, but it was very much a Vermonter-based program. Governor Gibb, who was the governor at the time it was passed, said that he envisioned it to be accessible to all Vermonters, and that some hearings could be conducted on the porch of the general store. It was intended to have a certain formality, but also a certain inclusiveness. That's been an important part of its success. What triggers Act 250 is either the size of the development, if it's a commercial project, or the number of residential lots or residential units that are being proposed. And that depends on whether a town has a municipal plan, zoning bylaws, and subdivision regulations in effect. Those towns that have all of those planning tools, a commercial project of 10 acres or greater, or 10 residential units or lots, triggers Act 250. Towns that don't have those tools in place, which is about half the towns in the state, a commercial development of 1 acre and 6 or more lots or units is what triggers Act 250 review in those communities. And that was also changed in 2004 when some other changes to the Act were made. There are 10 criteria to Act 250. However, there are several sub-criteria. So there's actually, when you count them all up, something like 33 or 34 criteria. But they're under these 10 categories. Straightforward water and air pollution, and that includes upland streams, headwater protection, wetlands protection, air and water pollution, stormwater runoff, water supply, whether there's an adequate water source available, the impact on water supply, whether it will impact neighbors and their ability to have access to potable water, soil erosion, traffic and transportation, whether a development will overburden educational services, schools in a town, or other municipal services like police, fire, road maintenance. There's a kind of a broad category of criteria that deals with aesthetics, the aesthetic character of a project, also historic preservation, impact on historic sites, and the protection of wildlife habitat. There's another category of criteria that involve a range of growth management concerns, issues like the ability of a community to, the impact of a development on a community's past investment, say in a downtown area, whether scattered development will have an impact on the ability of a community to service an area, or whether it will burden the public, and then protection of agricultural soils, forest runoff, and energy efficiency. So that criteria 9 is kind of a catch-all. And I'm seeing here that we didn't number these right. So there are 10 criteria, but what you see is 1 through 6 and 1 through 4. 1 through 4 being 7, 8, 9, and 10. And then finally, the 10th criteria, which is 4 on the right-hand side, is a conformance with municipal and regional plans. And that's an important consideration that municipalities and regional planning commissions have the right and responsibility to help determine the outcome of projects by writing clear municipal and regional plans. And there was an important Supreme Court case only last year that really reinforced and validated the right of a regional planning commission to have a strong voice in development decisions affecting the region. So those are, in a nutshell, the the summary of the existing criteria. Some of the things that are missing: impact on climate change. Arguably, that could be considered an air quality or air pollution criteria. But that's the kind of issue that wasn't widely understood or recognized nearly 50 years ago, and is a greater concern today. So, as I mentioned, over the years, the Act 250 has, I think, generally been viewed by a strong majority of the public as serving the state well. The first 25 years or so was kind of a groundbreaking period where a lot of precedent was set and the act was defined. Also during that time, the companion piece of legislation to have a land use context was defeated. That was somewhat replaced in the late 1980s with a planning law called Act 200. It really hasn't fulfilled the same purpose that was the small scale stuff that has a cumulative impact over time but doesn't get captured by Act 250. It lacks that planning framework, and it is less user friendly than it initially was because the appeals process was changed in 2004 from the citizen-based environmental board to a court system, and that has resulted in a lengthier, more time-consuming, and more expensive appeals process than what existed then. So those are some of our kind of initial kind of criticisms on Act 250. So what our priorities are going forward as an organization, we're encouraging people to pay attention to, and part of the process of these public sessions will be what are the issues that we value as Vermonters, and the ones that we've been really focusing on and highlighting include continuing to protect our farm and forest lands and to keep large forest blocks intact. Forest fragmentation is a growing problem in the state. As land is whittled into smaller and smaller parcels, there's no longer serve both the economic, the ecological, or the cultural and recreational values that large blocks of forest provide. And we are losing our agricultural land base on a regular basis, both through Act 250 and projects that don't get covered by Act 250. We're also, historically, Act 250 has in some respects treated development equally regardless of where it is, and we have long supported the development and revitalization of our downtowns and village centers. We've created several, we being the state of Vermont, have created several designation programs over the years, including a Vermont Neighborhoods program, a Village Center program, and a Growth Center program, and a Downtown program. How Act 250 treats development within those areas, which from our perspective helps to discourage that scattered residential and commercial sprawl in the countryside, is an important concern. I mentioned climate earlier. Initially, Act 250 was pretty revolutionary in how the Public Service Department in the state intervened and pushed energy efficiency and energy conservation. As we've developed more energy conservation and efficiency programs, Act 250 is not playing the same lead role that it once did. So how, moving forward, we deal with energy and climate change in Act 250 is a big question mark and an issue that we'd like to address. I mentioned the appeals process. There's widespread frustration with the process now, and that's not coming from our position as environmental advocates, but the development community will also has expressed concerns about it. So the commission has stated an interest in looking at that process and seeing whether there's any improvements that can and should be made to it. And then also related to that is just making sure that the infrastructure to support an open and fair and inclusive and efficient process is there. In recent years, there's been cuts to staffing for Act 250, some consolidation in Montpelier, and that's going to be an issue that the commission wants to look at. And we feel as though it's important that it be adequately supported by the state. And then finally, the most important thing is we see Act 250 as continuing to play a key role together with municipal and regional planning and land use regulation in guiding development in the state. And our goal is that we not only maintain the status of Act 250 as an important tool, but that we really enhance it with a stronger, more up-to-date law going forward. And that's our goal for the outcome of this session. So the agenda for some people have been surprised by how these sessions have been conducted. The agenda, and this is based on the current agenda from the Commission's webpage, is there's a welcoming session with introductions talking about what the purpose of the meeting is. There's a session on the basics of Act 250, a little bit more detailed than I just provided, getting people oriented about what's being talked about. And then there's a somewhat of a creative small group process. And this has been a source of frustration for a lot of folks, and we've been critical of the process. We really applaud the Commission for their desire to want to do something different, to go a little bit deeper than just everybody having 2 minutes at the mic to either criticize or applaud a component of Act 250. They've tried to have a small group session which allows people to interact with one another and engage in around different issues. The frustration has been they've asked for a ranking process of things that aren't necessarily exclusive of one another, whether you feel the importance of settlement patterns as being more important than ecological restoration or being more important than economic development. We've suggested that they use this card sorting process that they have as a starting point for conversation, and to ask people to rank their value of those independent of one another and not have them prioritize which is more important, because they all might be equally important. So I haven't heard back from the Commission whether they plan on changing the process, but that has been a source of criticism at both of the two meetings that have happened so far. Sure, go ahead, Kate.
This is Kate chiming in. I just want to back up a little bit and say what this card sorting exercise is. So what to expect is that when you will be assigned to a small group when you get there, and when it's time for the small group exercise, you will be given a series of cards. And I won't say exactly what's on those cards, because as Brian suggested, those could change before the next meeting as they hopefully improve the process. But the idea is that the cards will be conversation starters, and you will, in the past, people have been asked to prioritize the cards, which, as Brian said, is problematic. We're hoping that the items on the cards will just be fodder for discussion to elicit what people's values are around any of the different things Act 250 helps protect or enhance. So I just want to be really clear that when you sit down, it will be a small group discussion, but it's kind of facilitated and affected by this series of cards.
And they have a provision that allows groups, not individual, to inject new ideas. They're so-called disruptor cards into the discussion. And there's an opportunity to write questions that you'd like to see addressed, either as a group that you feel are important or as individual at the end of the meeting. There's not a lot of time for that individual question asking, though. Mm-hmm. It's mostly a group process facilitated by different folks at the different meetings, oftentimes folks who are associated with the local regional planning commission or otherwise from the professional planning community in the state. But whether or not you're going to be asked to set priorities and choose among different cards that have various values and concepts on them, or will be able to rank them independent of one another, is still a question we have going into this meeting. In the past, people have been asked to prioritize them, and it's caused quite a bit of friction at the two meetings, one of which I attended, and the other one John Groveland on our staff attended down in Manchester.
So I haven't attended a meeting yet. I plan on coming to the one in South Royalton. So I have a question for you, Brian, as I prepare. If I understood the plan correctly from the facilitators, there were supposed to be kind of two rounds with the cards. One round of cards would be these features on the landscape that Act 250 deals with. And then there was a second set of cards introduced, these disruptor cards. And I think the point of the disruptor cards, which were things like climate change or building a new road, is to sort of encourage people to think about how those values may change in the face of certain
That's right.
disruptions.
That's
So
right.
I just want to clarify that I think it's kind of a two-part discussion. First, you kind of talk about values, and then you sort of challenge yourself to think, well, how might those values be? How would you change the way you address your values in the face of certain challenges to the community or the state?
That's right. That's a better answer than the disruptor card. There is an opportunity to introduce new ideas, but that's not the use of the disruptor card. And there's an opportunity to have a second set of cards, which will talk about some of the processes, more administrative or procedural things. Okay. So it's an interesting process. It is, in our opinion, somewhat flawed, although I think the intent of the commission was admirable in wanting to do something different than the common process, and hopefully it will be refined over time, and this session might be a little bit smoother than the prior two, but we'll see.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would say that after you go to this session, we'd love to hear from you on what you thought about what worked and what didn't, what your experience was of being heard. As Brian said, we're fairly optimistic or grateful for the effort to have a small group discussion, because that traditionally has is known to allow more voices to be heard than is typical with hearing, in part just because not everybody likes public speaking. So we think that's interesting, and the tips that we give in the next few slides, we hope, are going to help you think of ways that you can engage in this format. All right, so that's what this slide is, ideas for engaging and preparing. Some of these are going to be pretty basic to many of you, and others might just be good reminders. But I would like to start at that basic level, just to help you enter the conversation most effectively. So the first idea that I want to present, or tip, is this idea of step up, step back. That's kind of shorthand for if you're someone who's very eager and likes to talk a lot, there may be times when you want to step back. If you're someone who is usually a little more retiring and shy, challenge yourself to step up and try to keep that flow going so that everybody can be included. Now, I'm not in any way suggesting that if you have an idea, you shouldn't say it. But this is a way, it can be step up, step back. It's kind of a shorthand reminder about remembering to engage in ways that really build your own credibility, as well as the credibility of people who are there speaking for the environment. So the second tip is actually me suggesting a little bit of homework, if you're open to that. Again, for many of you, it may go without saying, but I would suggest it would be worthwhile to think in advance about what you want to say. Even though you're going to be sitting in a circle with a card exercise, and even though it's a facilitated discussion, it still doesn't hurt to think in advance about a few key points that are important from your perspective to get into the conversation. And I should say that if the idea of preparation for an Act 250 meeting sounds a little daunting, I just want to assure you that you don't need to be an expert to participate in this conversation. You don't have to be an expert in the law to appreciate what it does or where it's lacking and provide that feedback. It's all valuable. So make some notes ahead of time. Don't be shy about bringing those notes to the conversation. As you're sitting in that circle, sort of listen for opportunities to get your points in there. Make sure that you're heard. Certainly you don't want to have a bunch of non sequiturs, but just listening for an opportunity to make that point that is important to you is very important. So just to give you an idea of what the range of feedback can be, you may have participated in Act 250 as a party. You may be neighbor to a project. Maybe you're a town official. Maybe you're someone who works for an organization that's participated. All of those perspectives are valid. So you might offer specific feedback based on your experience, like, I was a neighbor and the district coordinator really helped me know how to prepare my materials so that I could remain as a party to the process. Or you may just have more general feelings about Act 250, like, I was so relieved when Act 250 applied to a project in my community because I was worried that otherwise it wasn't going to be carefully vetted. You may have concerns based on your own experience or just based on your sense of how things are going in Vermont. For example, Act 250 really needs to deal more with incremental sprawl, commercial and residential. There are all these little buildings that are popping up. Isn't anyone making sure they're in the right place? It's also completely acceptable to put forth some kind of high-level values that you want upheld for Vermont, things that matter to you about the place where you live. And something like, I really appreciate that we have a working lands economy and that I can buy food and fuel locally. And I also appreciate that it makes possible an incredible landscape. Act 250 should do what it can to keep these things strong. So all of those are valid pieces of feedback. Speak from what you care about, experience and values. So what I've just said are some ideas for helping you make your points clearly and be ready to speak in the small group setting. I would also suggest that you could write up your comments and print them out and leave them with the legislator who is hosting the event. So each event is hosted, kind of emceed by one of the commissioners. And you can hand those comments to the commissioner, to the legislator as you're leaving. That way they know you're really serious, and that way even if you haven't made all your points, you've gotten your piece, you've said your piece and gotten it onto the record. It's also a way to get their attention, and if we do this meeting after meeting, to have people say, wow, the environmental community is really showing up, and they have a lot to say, we better listen. So a couple other ideas for engaging and preparing. Even if there's making your own points, there's also amplifying the points of other people, and just making sure that those don't get lost in the conversation. And these little text boxes here have a couple suggestions on ways to do that. Like if you're getting ready to say something, maybe you reference the person who came before. Like, I want to build on that good point that Nancy just made about how valuable I've found it that ... Or if maybe someone's point is not heard, you can help amplify that and make sure it doesn't get lost. Like, before we move on, I just want to make sure we don't lose Malcolm's point about stormwater. I think it's a really important aspect of this. So you can really help lift each other up and boost each other so that there's a good, steady drumbeat to ensure that these views are heard. These meetings will go by pretty quickly, even if an hour and 20 minutes in a small group sounds like a lot. My sense from people who've participated is that the conversations go by pretty quickly. So if that happens and you want to make sure that your voices are heard, you'll have your written comments. You can also follow up by email, and I've put the email address on this slide. It will also be on the next slide, but you can follow up with additional comments. And the other thing to stay tuned for is an online survey that we hear is forthcoming from the commission, and that will be another chance to weigh in. You can do any or all of those things, and we'd encourage you to do so. Last but not least, I want to, okay, so I've mentioned the email and the survey. Okay, great. So with that, what we're going to try next is hearing from you. We've just given you a lot of information about the commission itself, about a little bit about Act 250, about the meetings and what you can expect. And now we'd love to hear your questions about this process. So thanks to Stephanie, we now have the question box where we can see it. So go ahead and you can type in a question. The other thing I think we're going to do is take everybody off of mute. Yeah, let's do that. We're taking you off of mute so that you can speak up. And this is an experiment. Bear with us. If you're on the phone, which I think several of you are, take your phones off mute. The way that we're going to try and make sure that we get you is just, if you would like to say something, we can't see you raise your hand, but please say your name and we'll try and catch the names as they come. So with that, we would be very happy to answer any questions that you have. As I mentioned, this is an experiment. We can't hear you just yet, so if anyone's talking, I'm afraid that the experiment might be failing. Or maybe you just don't have any questions. All right, I think I would encourage that's us. That's feedback. I would encourage you to type in questions if you have any. I'm also going to change. Are we on video now, Stephanie? Yeah. That's all right. We're gonna take ourselves off video and show you the last slide, which has Brian's and my contact information there, our email addresses, a reminder about where the next presentation will be held, and then the opportunity to email for emailing the commission. So I think what we'll do, just because sometimes technology takes a little getting used to, we're going to stick around for a few minutes and see if any questions come in through our participant comment box. In the meantime, is there anything else, Brian, that you can think of that you want people to know about this process or their role in it?
No, I think this one, also in addition to our contact information, is the commission's contact information. They have a Facebook page and a website with all of the presentations and materials that have been presented to them so far, including most of the advisors provided presentations. We did, as far as what our goals are. So this isn't the only opportunity to comment. And then, of course, if there, as we anticipate, is a legislative push for amendments, we will be keeping all of our members and friends informed of that process, working with other folks, and would encourage your input at that time as well. So this is likely going to be a push to get this to the January deadline for the legislature, and then we anticipate it might be a 2-year effort to get some meaningful legislation passed out of the House and Senate.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So I maybe hear someone who is trying to ask a question who is off mute. I'd like to invite that person to go ahead and speak. Go ahead.
I believe I'm that person.
Yes, please go ahead.
I'm Nancy Sherman, and my question is, would you say the email address where we could email questions and get the survey for those of us who are on the phone at this point?
Yes, we'll also put it on our webpage and make sure you have it. We're sending out an e-newsletter, which we do the first Tuesday of every month, and we'll include it there. But it's Act 250 comments, all one word, at leg, L-E-G, really leg.state.vt.us, the standard government address. So Act 250 comments at leg.state.vt.us.
Yeah. And we'll send that around to Nancy.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking that.
So there's a question's been put up. How harmonious, contentious has the first couple of meetings been? They were actually, there was friction about the process. There was the small group that I participated in really rejected the idea of choosing between ecological protection and economic development, feeling as though it was fairly, that we can have two goals that aren't exclusive of one another and they could both be held in equal value. The same is true at the Manchester meeting. I will say, though, that the outcome of both meetings indicated extremely strong support for maintaining our environmental quality. That environmental protection / environmental restoration value was the highest value of both meetings. In Springfield, it was coupled with economic development. So in the small group discussion, the table I was at, there was definitely one guy who didn't agree with almost anything that I said or believed in, but we got along fine and it was well facilitated. The contentious nature was people really didn't like to have to be forced into making what they considered a false choice. But it was a good productive meeting otherwise.
So I think the next question is about when the upcoming meetings are, and there are going to be 3 of them. They're all from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. On August 22nd, there'll be a meeting in Island Pond. September 5th, there'll be a meeting in Rutland. And September 10th, there will be a meeting in Burlington. And we should have those on our website, and those are also on the Commission's Facebook page for those of you who Facebook. So we've answered the questions that are typed in, and I think I maybe hear someone on the phone who might like to ask a question. We'd be glad to answer it. One of the people who's currently driving has a question to ask. Nope. I'm afraid we can't hear you if you're that person right now. Like I said, it's an experiment. Thank you for bearing with us.
I also want to say,
If I'm the person driving, you answered my question. It was about the email address. So I'm
Oh,
still
good.
not muted, but
No problem.
you did my question.
Okay, great. Keep driving safely. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh. Phil had a question about the Burlington meeting, if it has been changed, and he's right. It's actually on September 12th, not September 10th. Thanks, Phil, for that clarification. I mentioned the Commission's Facebook page. That's another avenue for providing your feedback. After one of the first meetings, I saw someone go on the Facebook page, the Act 47 Facebook page, and sort of constructively say, there were some parts of this meeting that went really well, and other parts I just had a lot of concern about. And it's a venue. It's another venue. If it makes sense for you, please go ahead. All right, I'll pause for just another, maybe we'll kind of start our wrap up, and if others have questions that they want to type while we're giving you our concluding thoughts, please go right ahead. Thank you, most of all, for taking 45 minutes, 50 minutes out of your evening to hang out with us and talk about Act 250. We're really glad to share this information with you, and we really hope that this makes your experience of these public meetings a positive one where you can really be heard. You're all really important pro-environment voices. We need you there, and we appreciate that you're considering going to these meetings. I want to assure you that the process doesn't end with these public meetings. We talked about emailing the Commission. We talked about the survey. VNRC is going to continue to watch this. We're going to continue to watch this process until it's done. So during that time, we will be representing our long-held views and values, and we'll also be representing our members. So feel free at any time to come and talk with us about this. So we do have a question that has come in.
Yeah,
let's try it.
So Jeff, the question is the basic structure of district commissions and volunteer commissioners under consideration? And I think that I think everything is under consideration. There's every issue about both the criteria, the jurisdictional thresholds, and how it's administered are on the table. I will say that there has been a lot of positive comments about the district commission process to keep it inclusive, to keep it local. I think there's been some comments that parties might need more help. The district coordinators play an important role, whether they're getting the support they need. But that is going to be one of many questions that will be on the table. So I think every aspect of how the law works is under consideration. Whether or not that will rise to the same level of some of the other issues, I'm not sure. I know I've heard a lot more concern about the appeal process and the way the court functions in comparison to the old environmental board. That is definitely under consideration, but I do think the district process is as well.
Well, everybody, thank you again. We're going to conclude this webinar. Thank you for your time. Please be in touch with any questions and let us know how that meeting goes.
Yeah.
I'll see some of you there.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.